You a soldier, utterly pathetic. My father barked it over the clatter of forks and the ceiling fans thumping tired air through the Wharton VFW hall. Laughter ran down our table like spilled beer. Then the Navy captain, 2 seats away, set down his glass, cleared his throat, and stood. Heads turned. His voice carried past bingo boards and ship photos. Lieutenant Hayes, you'll lead the SEALs. The room went still. The band in the corner missed a beat. My father's grin slipped off his face. I stood because that's what you do. Aye, sir. The quiet that followed belonged to me. An hour earlier, it had just been a graduation dinner, steam from hotel pans, roast beef curling at the edges, potato salad with too much mustard. Post 533 smelled like old coffee and floor wax. A frame destroyer watched us like a patient witness. We took the long table by the trophy case. Dad Frank Hayes, refinery man, loud in every room, sat under a plaque that read, "All gave some." My brother Michael took the chair at his right collar, sharp as a ruler. Lauren, my sister-in-law, guarded a pecan pie sweating syrup. I wore dress whites under a blue blazer. Someone asked what I'd do after commissioning. The question hovered over the mashed potatoes. Dad answered before I could. Paperwork, he said, flicking salt with a wrist that had thrown wrenches for 30 years. She's book smart, not the mud type. He chuckled, the kind that wears a person down. Michael smiled his practiced smile. She'll be fine, he said. It sounded like support from far away. I took a sip of sweet tea and felt the ice bite. The Navy captain, Robert Gaines, had been introduced as a visiting speaker, invited to offer a few words to the new crop. He had the posture of a man who knew exactly where he stood. He let us be a family before the uniform spoke. I noticed and filed it away. Dad didn't notice him. He skewered brisket and leaned back like a judge preparing a verdict. You a soldier, he said louder now so the dominoes paused. Utterly pathetic. A cousin laughed without meaning to. Lauren pressed her napkin flat like cloth could hold words down. Silence can be a shield. I set my fork aside and watched condensation crawl down the tea pitcher and puddle on the paper placemat. On the placemat, an anchor held a rope that went nowhere. Captain Gaines's glass touched the table with a sound the room obeyed. He didn't hunt for applause. He stood precise and human, and the flag in the corner seemed to square its shoulders. Mr. Hayes, he said to my father, voice level, with respect. He turned to me, and the rank fit like a name. Lieutenant Hayes, you'll lead the SEALs. No flourish, just wait. The guitarist pocketed his pick. The dominoes game ended without a winner. Someone whispered, SEALs, like the word had teeth. Dad's fork hung mid-air, brisket trembling. Michael blinked like he'd missed his cue. Lauren's hand found mine under the table and squeezed once. I stood because the moment asked me to. My chair legs scraped the tile. Aye, sir, I said steady. Gaines nodded. Briefing after awards, he said and sat. He hadn't embarrassed anyone. He had just told the truth aloud. Earl, the post commander. A voice like a porch swing tapped the mic. Well, folks, he said, glancing at the flag, looks like we've got more to celebrate than brisket. Laughter returned gentler now, like the room was learning a new key. Dad tried to speak and found air instead of words. For as long as I can remember, he has carried a pocketful of stories. Bar fights, broken up machines, fixed in a storm, a night he outdrank a foreman and still made dawn shift. Stories where volume passed for victory. That night the pocket came up empty. He drank beer he didn't want and stared at my blazer like it hit a trick. An old sailor from the domino table came over cap in hand. Ma'am? He said to me, voice roughed by salt and years bring 'em home. There are only a few honest replies to a request like that. I'll do my best, I said. Awards were handshakes and a photo in front of the flag that always lists a little to port. The air conditioner rattled. Outside, the courthouse clock told 6, and Main Street wore that hot bronze light that makes even a feed store look important. Cicadas started up in the pecan trees like someone flipped a switch. People will tell that moment later, like a headline. Captain taps new leader. Father silenced. They'll reduce it to a jaw dropping and a room going quiet. For me, it was smaller and larger at once. Smaller because it was only a sentence. Larger because every mile I had walked in silence arrived together and put a hand between my shoulders. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Pride isn't loud. It moves through a room like good weather after a long drought. You feel it in how people settle in, how their eyes steady when they look at you. It doesn't crush contempt. It starves it. In that hall with fans thumping and coffee burning and the destroyer watching from its frame, contempt finally ran out of air. If you want to know how we reached that table, why a captain would stand, and why a father would fall quiet, you have to go back. Not far. Just to the rooms where a person is measured, a small kitchen off Alabama Street, a gym that smelled like rubber and ambition. The day a counselor wrote ROTC on a scrap of paper, and I folded it into my wallet like a ticket I wasn't sure I'd ever cash. The day before, we were only a family around a table. The day after, everything would carry a different light. For now, remember the sentence, the room that heard it and the quiet that followed finally on my side. If you want to understand what happened in that VFW hall, you need to know the ground it grew out of. Families plant seeds in the smallest ways, and those seeds carry forward longer than you'd think. Ours was planted on Alabama Street in a 2-bedroom house that always smelled like coffee and motor oil. My father, Frank Hayes, worked 30 years at the Gulf refinery outside Wharton, Texas. He came home every evening with the grit of the plant still clinging to him. He believed in calloused hands and voices that could carry over engines. A man proves himself by what he can lift, he used to say usually while clinking his long neck bottle against the kitchen table. If you couldn't lift it, you weren't worth much in his eyes. My brother Michael was born 2 years after me, but from the start, he was the shining one. He had Dad's broad shoulders, Mom's easy smile, and the knack for charming anyone from the grocery clerk to the high school principal. At age 6, he could throw a football clear across the yard, and Dad beamed like he'd just seen the second coming. Idana Hayes was bookish. I liked maps, puzzles, anything that required more thinking than shouting. In grade school, I'd sit cross-legged on the floor with an atlas tracing rivers with my finger while Dad watched Michael wrestle with neighborhood kids in the dirt. Nobody ever cheered when I finished a book. I remember one fall afternoon at the Wharton County Fair. Michael was 12, competing in a youth wrestling bracket. Dad stood at the fence, hollering like a man possessed. When Michael pinned his opponent, Dad lifted him high, the whole crowd clapping. That same day, I received an ROTC ribbon for a drill competition. It wasn't even announced over the loudspeaker. I carried it folded in my pocket while Dad grilled burgers, still talking about Michael's fight in the blood. It wasn't that Dad hated me, he just couldn't see me. He looked through me the way you look through a window at a field. You know it's there, but you're interested in something farther off. At home, the hierarchy was clear. Michael took the head seat at Sunday breakfast, elbows wide spinning stories about practice and coaches. Dad asked questions, clapped him on the back, told him he'd be a commander one day, though he meant a football captain. I poured juice-buttered toast and waited for a pause that never came. Once during my sophomore year of high school, I came home with a report card straight A's. I set it on the table, proud but careful. Dad glanced at it and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Computers will pay well." He meant it as praise, but it landed flat. 10 minutes later, Michael came in from practice with a grass stain down his jersey, and Dad whooped like he'd won state. The silence I carried started young. Not sulking silence, just the quiet of knowing words wouldn't change anything. I learned to read instead of argue, to observe instead of interrupt. By the time I was 16, my teachers noticed more about me than my family did. Mrs. Gardner, my history teacher, pressed a pamphlet into my hand. One day, ROTC programs, scholarships, a path to something beyond the county line. She said, "Dana, you think like a strategist." I folded that pamphlet into my wallet and didn't tell a soul. Dad's idea of service was limited. He respected Marines because they looked like they could break walls with their fists. He respected cops because they carried guns. But a daughter in uniform. He'd chuckle and say, "That's a uniform for parades, not for real work." It wasn't malicious. It was just how he'd come to measure the world. Michael fed on that attention. He became the golden boy of Wharton High quarterback prom king ROTC cadet commander. When recruiters came around, they looked at him first. Dad said things like, "He's a natural leader." Then he'd look at me, shrug, and add, "And Dana's the smart one," as if smart was consolation. On winter night around the kitchen table, while the heater rattled, Dad leaned back in his chair and made it official. "Michael makes something of himself. Dana, you'll be fine. You'll probably retire early, settle somewhere quiet." He said it with such certainty that even Mom nodded, not unkindly. I didn't argue. I folded that sentence next to the pamphlet in my wallet and let both sit there like promissory notes. Years later, when people ask why I never challenged Dad outright, I tell them this. Arguing with someone who's already written your ending doesn't buy you a new story. It just wastes your breath. Better to hold your breath and save it for the climb. That climb began the day I filled out the ROTC forms in the guidance counselor's office, signing my name in pen that shook only once. I mailed the envelope myself, walking it 3 blocks to the post office, feeling like I was carrying something fragile and explosive at the same time. Dad never knew. He thought my weekends at study sessions were just me hiding at the library. He didn't ask, and I didn't tell. Silence had become my ally. By senior year, Michael had recruiters circling, and I had acceptance letters, none of which I mentioned at dinner. I sat in the bleachers watching Michael run touchdowns, the crowd chanting his name, and I thought, let him have the noise. I'll take the map. Every family builds its own myth. Ours was that Michael was the warrior, and I was the shadow. That myth lasted until the day Captain Gaines put his glass down in that VFW hall. But to understand the depth of that moment, you need to see the years when the myth felt unshakable, when even I almost believed it. Because if you've spent your life being the quiet one, you don't break the silence easily. You wait until the silence itself carries weight. Graduation day came humid and restless like most May mornings in Wharton. The sun burned through thin clouds, turning Main Street into a parade of dust and heat shimmer. Families parked along the courthouse square, men in Sunday shirts fanning themselves with folded bulletins, women balancing casseroles for later potlucks. Our small town knew how to celebrate milestones. High school football championships, rodeo, wins a return from overseas all had the same mix of fried food, folding chairs, and flags fluttering in the Texas wind. For me, this was college graduation. I had finished my degree and my ROTC commission at Texas A&M. It wasn't a parade in my honor, but the local VFW hall had offered to host a dinner. Dad jumped at the chance not because he was proud, but because it gave him an audience. He loved an audience. Inside the hall, folding tables were pushed together, each covered with plastic cloth patterned with faded anchors. Crockpots steamed along the buffet line, and the smell of barbecue mingled with the faint tang of floor wax. Old veterans shuffled cards in the corner until the speeches began. The air conditioner rattled, losing the battle against the heat. My brother Michael arrived in a crisp shirt, his posture honed from years of Dad's encouragement. He had become a financial advisor, not a soldier, but you wouldn't know it from the way Dad introduced him to everyone. This one, Dad said, clapping his shoulder, could have led a company if he'd wanted. The guests smiled politely, nodding at the golden sun. I sat across the table in my blazer, the white of my uniform tucked underneath, mostly hidden. The silver bar on my collar caught the light when I turned my head, but no one noticed. They were busy filling plates with brisket and potato salad. Aunt Marlene leaned over with a smile. "So Dana, what's next for you, teaching computers?" Her voice was kind, but the assumption stung. I opened my mouth to answer, but Dad beat me to it. "Paperwork," he said, shoving a forkful of beans into his mouth. "She'll be shuffling papers for the Navy, not storming beaches." Laughter scattered like loose change across the table. I forced a smile and sipped my sweet tea. The ice cracked a sharp sound in the low rumble of voices. My silence settled over me like armor. Michael leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "She's not cut out for mud and sweat, Dad. Let her have her office job. Less stress." He said it like he was defending me, but his grin said otherwise. Lauren, my sister-in-law, chuckled. "Honestly, Dana, sometimes I forget you're even in the military. You're so low-key. That earned another round of nods and chuckles. Dad pointed his fork at me, eyes gleaming with certainty. She'll never last past training. Mark my words. She'll drop out before the first real test. I wanted to tell them that training was already behind me, that I'd run miles in boots through rain, carried packs heavier than any briefcase Michael would ever lift, and learned to strip a rifle blindfolded while others quit in tears. But the words stuck. Instead, I pressed my palm flat on the table, feeling the sticky ring from a spilled Coke seep under my skin. I reminded myself of the lesson I'd learned years ago. Silence was more powerful than defense. Let them talk. Dad laughed again, leaning back so far his chair squealed against the tile. Utterly pathetic, he said, shaking his head. A girl like you, thinking you're a soldier. The veterans at the next table turned their eyes toward us. They didn't say anything. Old men with caps from Korea and Vietnam, they had seen their share of families talking big. Captain Robert Gaines sat 2 seats down, invited by the post commander as a guest speaker for the graduating class. He had been polite all evening, listening more than talking, his eyes steady, his uniform crisp. He set down his glass with a deliberate clink, clearing his throat. The sound cut through the laughter. Dominoes stopped mid-game. Dad turned, still smirking. Mr. Hayes, Gaines said evenly with respect. He turned to me. Lieutenant Hayes, you'll lead the SEALs. The words rolled out like steel laid on oak. No exaggeration, no performance. Just fact. The hall went quiet. The band in the corner missed a note. Someone dropped a fork, the clatter echoing in the stillness. Dad froze his fork midway to his mouth. Michael's jaw slackened. Lauren blinked as if she had misheard. I rose slowly, chair scraping back against the floor. The silence was complete, the kind of silence that demands attention. I saluted crisp and sure. Aye, sir. Captain Gaines nodded, once then returned to his seat as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the room knew better. My father tried to laugh again, but the sound caught in his throat. He took a sip of beer. He didn't want staring at me like he had never seen me before. The words utterly pathetic hung in the air, sour and limp. That night ended differently than it began. The dominoes resumed, the band played a slower tune, and people avoided looking directly at Dad. But in the quiet that followed, something shifted. For the first time, contempt had no air to breathe. Still, that wasn't the start of my story. It was only the unveiling. The truth of how I had carried myself to that moment lay years earlier in mud and silence and work no one saw. The truth is, I should have quit a dozen times before I ever wore that uniform to the VFW hall. Boot camp at Great Lakes was designed to grind people down, and it did. The first morning, the petty officer screamed us awake before dawn, and the cold punched me harder than any insult my father had ever thrown. My boots were stiff, my hands raw, and the air smelled of sweat and disinfectant. Some recruits came from military families, kids who'd grown up saluting before they learned to ride a bike. They swaggered through those first weeks, certain the Navy was just another stage where they could perform. Me, I carried the weight of my father's laughter. Every time I slipped on an obstacle or lagged in a run, I heard him utterly pathetic. The first time I scaled the rope wall, my arms gave out halfway up. My palms burned rope fibers, tearing into skin. I slid down, landing hard, and laughter echoed from a few of the guys. One whispered loud enough for me to hear, "She won't last a month." I didn't answer. I stood, wiped the blood on my trousers, and went back to the end of the line. Second try, I climbed higher, teeth clenched, lungs on fire. I still didn't make it. Third try, I reached the top, and when my boots hit the ground, I didn't smile. I just moved on. Silence again became my weapon. Nights in the barracks, I wrote letters I never mailed. Drafts that began with "Dear Dad," I made it another day, and ended with, "But I guess you'll never believe me." I tore them up before lights out. Nobody needed to read my confessions. Training had a way of exposing people. One kid from Ohio broke down crying on the firing line, unable to handle the weight of responsibility. Another faked an ankle injury and disappeared overnight duffel bag, carried by someone else. But I stayed. Every morning, I woke to that whistle laced up boots and told myself, one more day. Graduation from boot camp wasn't fireworks. It was standing at attention, watching families cheer from the bleachers. Some recruits spotted their dads in the crowd, saluting back with tears in their eyes. I scanned the stands, though I hadn't invited anyone. I knew what Dad would have said. It's just basic. Anyone can get through that. So I let the moment pass. From there, I was assigned to officer candidate school. Harder academics, sharper discipline. I thrived in the classroom strategy, logistics, communications. That was my arena. But outside during PT, the same sneers followed me. Bookworm, they called me. Brainiac. In the Navy, brains were tolerated, but brawn was worshipped. One night, after a 14-hour day, my roommate collapsed onto her rack. "Dana, how do you keep going?" she asked. Her voice cracked, exhaustion weighing her down. I shrugged. I don't think about finishing. I just think about not quitting. She laughed weakly. That's the same thing. Not really, I said. Finishing is a dream. Not quitting is a choice. When I pinned on my commission, I felt pride, but quiet pride. No one in my family came. Michael had a conference. Dad said he couldn't take off work, and Mom sent a card that arrived 2 weeks late. A few lines in her careful handwriting. "We're proud of you. Stay safe." My first assignment wasn't glamorous. Logistics support at Norfolk. Stacks of papers, long hours, endless supply reports. To outsiders, it looked like Dad had been right. I was doing paperwork. But logistics isn't just paper. It's life. When supply chains fail, sailors go hungry, ships run dry, missions collapse. I learned quickly that details mattered. A mislabeled crate could mean the difference between an operational radar and a blind ship. My commanding officer noticed. "Hayes," he said one evening, handing back a corrected manifest, "you've got eyes like a hawk." I nodded, saying nothing. Months later, my quiet work surfaced in the middle of chaos. A convoy en route to the Mediterranean hit a snag. One ship delayed another, low on fuel. Communications scrambled. Command was ready to reroute them into risky waters. I caught the discrepancy in fuel reports. It didn't add up. I flagged it. Argued quietly, but firmly, and my CO trusted me. They changed the course. 2 days later, word came back the alternate route had been scouted by hostile patrols. Lives had been spared, though no one outside the chain knew why. At the next family gathering, Michael bragged about his promotion at the firm. Dad beamed. "That's my boy." Then he turned to me, fork in hand. "Still moving papers around, Dana?" I smiled and said something like that. Because how do you explain that your so-called paperwork had saved 30 sailors? How do you explain that silence can hold lives? I didn't need their applause. What I needed was to keep going. Each dismissal, each shrug from Dad became another brick in the wall. I was building a wall that would one day stand tall enough for him to see. But in those early years, all I had was grit, long nights, and the echo of his laughter. My first brush with the SEALs didn't come with banners or salutes. It started in a windowless room in Norfolk, the kind with flickering fluorescent lights and coffee that tasted like it had been burning since the Cold War. I'd been moved into intelligence analysis, a posting few outside the building cared about, but one that carried quiet weight. The room was stacked with maps, coded cables, satellite imagery, pinned up with push tacks. It smelled of pencil shavings and damp paper. Our job was to sort through chaos, radio chatter, encrypted messages, odd supply routes, and make sense of it before it reached commanders in the field. Most officers hated the monotony. I loved it. Patterns spoke to me. Where others saw static, I saw signals. One night, I spotted a sequence in intercepted transmissions from the Horn of Africa. The chatter hinted at an ambush along a resupply route. A SEAL team was scheduled to pass through that exact area within 12 hours. I flagged it, pushed it up the chain, and insisted on review. A lieutenant older than me rolled his eyes. "Hayes, you're overthinking. These guys can handle anything." But I didn't back down. I'd learned long ago that silence didn't mean surrender. I put the data on his desk and said, "Sir, if you're wrong, men die. If I'm wrong, we waste 20 minutes. He grudgingly relayed the warning. The SEALs altered course. Hours later, reports came back an ambush site had been found explosives rigged in the dirt rifles waiting. They walked away because of a choice I made in a room no one cared about. The next day, the team leader came into our office. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain t-shirt, shoulders heavy with muscle and silence. He didn't introduce himself. He just set a patch on my desk, the kind SEALs wore on their gear. "We don't forget," he said, then walked out. That patch stayed in my desk drawer for years, unseen by my family. Back home, Dad still believed I was buried in forms. "She's got a desk job," he'd tell relatives at Thanksgiving between bites of turkey. "Better than being out in the mud." Michael would nod, smirking, the golden sun basking in attention. No one asked me what I actually did. In truth, I was being pulled deeper into the SEAL's shadow world. Missions needed eyes as much as they needed boots. I became the quiet voice in the background, rerouting teams away from danger, analyzing drone feeds, piecing together puzzles no one else wanted to touch. The work came at a cost. I went weeks without sunlight, days blurred into nights under fluorescent hum. Sometimes I'd come home to my apartment, peel off my jacket, and sit on the floor just to feel something solid. I thought about calling Dad, telling him what I was doing, but the words stuck. What would he say? A soldier. Utterly pathetic. I didn't need to hear it again. Instead, I let my silence thicken into armor. One mission still lingers in my mind. A SEAL platoon deployed in the Philippines lost comms for 12 hours. Panic rippled up the chain, everyone feared the worst. I stayed late combing through satellite blips. At 3 a.m., I caught a faint signal pattern. It wasn't voice, just data bursts, bouncing oddly across the sea. I followed the trail, recalculated, and located their position. They were stranded, running low on supplies, pinned by weather. We coordinated a rescue flight, rerouted in the dead of night. When the team returned, bruised but alive, no one knew why. They never asked. I sat in the briefing room, sipping burnt coffee, listening to chatter about good luck and solid leadership. My name never came up. And that was fine. I hadn't done it for recognition. Still, a small part of me wanted anyone to know. One Friday evening, I drove home to Wharton for a family dinner. Mom made roast chicken. Dad poured himself a beer. Michael told a story about a client he saved from bankruptcy. They laughed, clapped him on the back. Then Dad turned to me, smirking. "Still hiding behind a desk, Dana? Bet you could retire early at this rate." I smiled politely, passing the mashed potatoes. "Still working," I said. Silence again. Inside, though, I thought of the SEAL patch in my desk drawer. I thought of the men alive because of signals I read. And I knew something my father never would, that desks can hold more power than rifles. I stayed in the shadows because shadows don't need applause. They need results. And yet, every time I heard the word pathetic roll off my father's tongue, I tightened my grip on the silence that would one day become my answer. By the time I reached my 30s, I had grown used to living in two worlds. In one, I was the quiet daughter who came home a few times a year, sat at the kitchen table, and listened to my father and brother swap stories. In the other, I was an officer with clearance, moving through secure hallways and locked conference rooms, piecing together threads that held operations steady. Promotions came, but they came quietly. First lieutenant, then lieutenant commander, then commander. Each time, the news was handed to me in a plain office with no witnesses, just a handshake and a set of papers. No fanfare, no cake, no flags. My family never knew. The dates never asked, never marked the milestones. Michael's milestones, though, those were celebrated like holidays. He made partner at his firm, and Dad threw a barbecue in the backyard, inviting half the block. Michael bought a new truck, and Dad bragged about it for weeks at the diner. When I once mentioned a transfer to San Diego, Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. "That's nice. Weather's good there," he said. It wore on me more than I wanted to admit. The silence I carried had once felt like armor, but over time, it began to feel like a weight pressing me down. At family reunions, relatives asked Michael for advice about finances, cars, even home repairs. When they turned to me, their questions were softer, vaguer. Still with the Navy, they'd ask as though it were a temporary hobby. "Yes," I'd reply. "Always yes?" I remember one Thanksgiving when the house was full, cousins running wild in the yard, the smell of pecan pie drifting through the windows. Michael held court in the living room, telling a loud story about a golf tournament. Dad laughed so hard tears streaked his face. Then someone asked me, "So what exactly do you do again, Dana?" "Operational planning," I answered, keeping it short. They nodded vaguely, already turning back to Michael. It was as if I had said filing clerk instead of the person who keeps sailors alive. But I never corrected them. Correcting meant defending, and defending meant weakness in my father's world, so I let the silence stand. Inside, though, I wrestled with doubts. Was I doing it wrong? Was the work worth it? If no one knew, I told myself that recognition wasn't the point, that the lives saved and missions accomplished mattered more than applause. And I believed it most days. Still, the cracks showed. One evening in Norfolk, after a 14-hour shift, I stopped by the base chapel. It was empty except for the faint smell of candle wax. I sat in the back pew, staring at the wooden cross, and whispered, "Am I invisible, or am I just meant to be unseen?" No answer came, of course, just the creak of the rafters. Yet every time I returned to work, the shadows felt like home again. My specialty became disaster aversion, the kind of operations that never made the news because they never turned into disasters. A hacked radar system neutralized before anyone knew it was compromised. A shipment of weapons intercepted before it left port. 3 near collisions in contested waters prevented by digital interference I had helped design. Each victory was invisible, wrapped in classified files and sealed envelopes. The sailors slept, the ships sailed, and no one knew what had almost gone wrong. No medals, no speeches. Just a quiet commendation slipped into a folder. Meanwhile, Dad's dismissals continued. At Christmas, he leaned back in his recliner, beer in hand, and said, "You'll probably burn out before you ever make command." Nothing wrong with that. Some people just aren't cut out for the long haul. I smiled the same smile I'd perfected since childhood and helped Mom clear the plates. It hurt, of course it did, but hurt can be useful if you let it harden into resolve. Because here's the truth I had learned: some careers are built in the spotlight and some are built in silence. And silence, though it weighs heavy, can carry farther than applause. Still, there were nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling of a bare apartment, wondering if I'd chosen wrong. Wondering if 30 years from now, all I'd have to show was a stack of unmarked folders and a father's smirk. But then the call would come, the briefing would land on my desk, and I'd remember. Lives depended on what I did in the shadows. That was enough. At least it had to be. Every officer has one moment that changes everything, not in medals or headlines, but in the way the air shifts when you walk into a room. Mine came during an operation in the Pacific that never made the evening news. The briefing was short-delivered in a secure room that smelled of burnt coffee and metal. A rogue network was smuggling weapons along a shipping lane near the South China Sea. Intelligence suggested state backing, though no one said it aloud. A SEAL platoon was sent to intercept, and I was on the intelligence team supporting from Norfolk. Just another mission or so, it seemed. For 48 hours straight, I monitored satellite feeds, combed through data-tracked signals bouncing across the ocean. Most of it was noise. Then, at 2 a.m., a fragment of chatter slipped through, encrypted, faint but wrong. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart ticking faster. It wasn't just smugglers. A submarine was shadowing the lane, lying in wait. If the SEALs moved forward, they'd walk straight into a kill zone. I called it out, flagged it to the operations officer. He frowned. "That's speculation, Hayes. We don't have confirmation." "Sir," I said evenly, "if I'm right, we're sending 30 men into an ambush. If I'm wrong, we've wasted an hour." Silence stretched. He finally sighed and told me to escalate. The room buzzed as decisions rippled upward. Communications went back and forth, tension coiling like a spring. Then the call came: redirect the platoon shift, the intercept point. They moved under cover of darkness, not knowing why. Hours later, confirmation arrived. Drone footage revealed the ambush site mines seeded in the water enemy fighters dug into the shoreline. The submarine had been waiting engines cold. If the platoon had continued as planned, they wouldn't have come back. Instead, they captured the smugglers, seized crates of weapons, and pulled out without firing a shot. Official reports called it an efficient operation. To me, it was survival. The next day, as the sun rose pale over Norfolk, the SEAL team leader walked into the intelligence room. He had salt still crusted on his uniform eyes, red from no sleep. He didn't smile. He just looked at me, steady and sharp. "You saved my men," he said. Then he walked out. That sentence carried more weight than any medal. But medals did come quiet ones. A commendation delivered in a sealed folder, stamped classified. No public recognition, no family invited. Just my CO shaking my hand and saying, "Good work, Commander Hayes." I tucked the folder into my drawer beside the patch I'd been given years earlier. Proof of a life lived in silence. When I visited home the next month, Dad was grilling in the backyard, smoke curling into the evening sky. Michael had just announced he'd been invited to speak at a conference in Dallas. Dad slapped him on the back, grinning. "That's my boy. Knows how to command a room." Then he turned to me. "Still at that desk job? Probably retired early at this rate, huh?" He chuckled, flipping burgers. I smiled politely, holding my tongue. But inside, I thought of the submarine, the minds, the lives that hadn't been lost, because I had spoken up. Dad would never know. That's the thing about silence, it doesn't demand attention. It just waits. And that operation taught me something I hadn't fully understood before. The shadows weren't a weakness. They were a vantage point. While others played their roles under bright lights, I was moving pieces where no one could see. Some careers are built in noise. Mine was built in the quiet that saves lives. The summons came in a plain folder, slid across a table in a conference room deep inside the Pentagon. Joint Operation Triton. Command transfer. Rear Admiral Dana Hayes. The words were typed in black, neat as a tombstone. I stared at them for a long while, my hands resting on the stars that had been sitting in my drawer waiting. For years I had worked in silence, the one no one asked about, the daughter, overlooked, the sister, dismissed. Now, suddenly, they wanted me at the front of the room. No shadows, no desk in the corner, public command. On the morning of the summit, I put on my dress whites. The fabric was crisp, the silver stars freshly pinned. I stood in the mirror and almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I hadn't earned it, but because I had carried that image silently for so long. The Pentagon's briefing auditorium was already packed when I stepped into the wings. Rows of uniforms filled the seats. Navy, Marines, Air Force, NATO officers in tailored suits. The air buzzed with coffee whispers and the rustle of notepads. At the podium, my brother Michael was finishing a presentation on readiness. He looked sharp, confident, the same golden son who had always commanded rooms. "Our team is prepared," he declared, voice booming. "We've conducted 5 joint drills. We're eager to support whoever takes command of Triton." Polite laughter trickled across the hall. Michael basked in it. My father sat in the front row, chin lifted with pride, watching his son. Then General Harlan stepped forward. The room stilled. "Thank you, Commander Hayes," he said. Michael bowed his head slightly, a smile tugging at his lips. Harlan's voice dropped into the tone that bends a room. "Today's briefing is more than a summary. It's a transition. Effective immediately, command of Operation Triton will fall under Rear Admiral Dana Hayes." The silence that followed was absolute. Pens froze mid-stroke. Eyes widened. I heard someone whisper my name as if testing it against the air. Michael turned, stunned. Dad blinked, mouth opening, but no words arriving. I stepped out from the wings. Each stride felt deliberate, steady. My stars caught the light, undeniable. I reached the podium, saluted, and Harlan returned it. "Admiral?" he said, handing me the microphone. I looked out at the sea of faces. "Good morning," I began, voice even. "As of Aero 900, today I have assumed operational command of Triton. Our objective is precision, not provocation. We will operate with clarity, strength, and unity." I kept it short. I didn't need theatrics. The weight was in the silence that followed. And then, one by one, the officers began to rise. first the front row, then the next, until the whole room stood in a wave, saluting. A wall of respect I had never asked for, but had earned in every unseen moment. I returned the salute, my throat tight but my face steady. In the front row, Dad remained seated, at first his hand frozen on his knee. His jaw worked like he was chewing on every word he had ever said to me. Pathetic, retired early, not cut out. For the first time, he seemed small in the chair. When he finally stood, it wasn't with bravado. It was because the silence left him no choice. Michael's face was pale. His pen dropped, his eyes locked on me. Recognition late, but real. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just stood in my uniform, the room at attention, and let the silence do what it had been waiting to do all my life, answer. That moment wasn't just mine. It was for every quiet one who had been underestimated, dismissed, laughed at. In that hall, contempt had no air left to breathe. When the briefing ended, the officers filed out in orderly lines, their shoes tapping against the polished floor. I stepped off the stage, the adrenaline cooling, replaced by a steady calm. General Harlan clapped me on the shoulder, his voice low. "You've carried this long enough. Let them see it now." In the hallway, I heard the sound of hurried footsteps. Dana. Wait. It was Michael. His ribbon shifted awkwardly as he caught up, his face still pale. He looked at me like he'd never seen me before. You never told me," he said. I stopped, turning to him. My voice was even. "You never asked." He flinched at that. For once, Michael had no story to tell, no punchline ready. He just stood there, shoulders sagging, eyes full of something that looked a lot like shame. "Do you know what it felt like?" he said softly. "Sitting in the front row and hearing your name?" "Yes," I answered. "That's exactly how I wanted it to feel." He nodded slowly, like the truth had finally broken through the armor he'd worn since childhood. "Okay," he whispered. "I deserved that." That evening, I received a message on my phone from Dad. Just a few words, "Didn't know. I see it now. Proud of you, kid." No emojis, no fanfare, just a plain sentence that carried the weight of 30 years. I stared at it for a long time before setting the phone down. Some words don't need an immediate reply. Weeks later, I attended another ceremony in that same auditorium. This time, I sat in the back, watching a new group of officers pin their ranks. Michael was on stage giving a speech, shaking hands. At one point, he looked into the crowd and saw me. Our eyes met, and for the first time in our lives, he didn't try to outshine me. He just nodded, quiet, respectful. That was enough. At Thanksgiving, the table was the same roast turkey pecan pie, the hum of football on TV. But something had shifted. Dad asked how my team was doing in the Pacific. Michael listened without interruption. My niece, only 15, looked at me wide-eyed and asked, "Aunt Dana, is it true you command SEALs?" "Yes," I said. She grinned. "That's kind of badass." I laughed, the sound easy. Later, when the dishes were done and the house had quieted, I sat alone on the porch. The stars in the sky were the same ones I wore on my shoulders. I thought back to the years of silence, the rope burns on my hands, the long nights with only a desk lamp for company, the countless times I swallowed words at family dinners. All of it had led here. And I realized something: you don't forgive those who doubt you. You outlast them. You outwork them. You let the truth speak for itself, not with noise or vengeance, but with presence. Because real command isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about holding the line when no one's looking, about carrying the weight even when it goes unseen. So if you've ever been doubted, dismissed, laughed at, remember this. Silence isn't weakness. It's patience. And when the moment finally comes, it will speak louder than any insult ever could. If this story moved, you share it. Too many of our quiet warriors, military or otherwise, go unseen, their strength mistaken for absence. Let's honor them, the ones who held the line without applause. And if you know someone like Rear Admiral Hayes, send this to them. They'll understand. Thank you for listening.